At first, they asked questions because questions were a way to stay oriented, a way to understand where they were, what was expected, and how long this state might last. When answers did not come, the questions changed shape, becoming quieter, fewer, and more cautious, until asking itself began to feel unnecessary. What unsettled them was not being refused an explanation, but realizing that no explanation seemed required, and that silence had quietly taken the place of response. In the early days of captivity, questions felt necessary, almost instinctive, because asking was a way to remain connected to the world as it had existed before the wire and the routines took over. Men asked about schedules, about rules, about what would happen next, not because they expected detailed answers, but because speaking kept the mind active and pointed forward. A question, even an unanswered one, still suggested that there was something ahead to understand, something that could eventually be explained. At first, the responses were minimal but functional. Instructions were repeated when needed, gestures replaced words, and silence filled the gaps without apology. The prisoners noticed quickly that explanations were not part of the structure here, and that the system operated without the need to justify itself. This did not immediately stop the questions, but began to change their tone, making them shorter, more cautious, and less frequent, as if each man were testing how much curiosity the environment would tolerate. Over time, asking began to feel inefficient. Questions slowed movement, drew attention, and rarely produced information that altered outcomes, whether they asked or remained silent. The day unfolded the same way, following a rhythm that did not bend in response to uncertainty. The men began to understand that clarity was not something to be requested, but something to be endured without, and this realization shifted how they interacted with the world around them. The absence of explanation did not feel hostile, but it was persistent, and persistence has a way of reshaping behavior. When nothing reacts to curiosity, curiosity loses its urgency. Some men continued to ask quietly, almost out of habit, but others stopped entirely, conserving energy for observation instead of inquiry. Watching became more useful than speaking, because patterns could be detected without the risk of exposure that questions carried. Inside the barracks, this change was visible in small ways. Conversations shortened, pauses grew longer, and shared speculation gave way to individual interpretation. Each man began to build his own understanding of the camp based on repetition rather than instruction, learning what mattered by noticing what never changed. The fences stayed where they were, the counts arrived on time, and the days passed without commentary, reinforcing the idea that explanation was unnecessary for the system to function. The guards did not discourage questions directly, but they did not encourage them either, and this neutrality sent a clear message without stating aloud. Authority here did not require dialogue, and control did not depend on comprehension. This absence of engagement made questions feel out of place, like echoes in a room that no longer responded to sound. Eventually, many men chose silence not as submission, but as adaptation, because adaptation required fewer assumptions. As questions faded, attention turned inward. Without answers to occupy the mind, thoughts drifted toward memory, routine, and the slow passage of time. The need to understand was replaced by the need to endure, and endurance demanded a different kind of focus, one that did not rely on information. The men learned to move through the day without expecting explanation, accepting that not knowing was part of the structure rather than a problem to be solved. This shift was subtle, and it did not happen all at once. There was no moment when questions officially stopped, only a gradual thinning, as fewer were asked and fewer felt worth forming. What remained was a quiet acceptance that meaning would not be provided from outside, and that asking for it only highlighted its absence. In this way, Silence became practical, not imposed, and the lack of explanation became something to live alongside rather than resist. By the end of this phase, many prisoners no longer noticed that they had stopped asking. The habit had simply fallen away, replaced by observation, patience, and a careful attention to routine. Questions had once offered a sense of direction, but here, direction no longer depended on understanding. The day required presence, not clarity, and the men adjusted accordingly, stepping into a form of captivity where silence was not enforced, but chosen, because it asked less of them than unanswered curiosity ever could. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As questions disappeared from daily life, silence did not feel like an absence, but like a tool that allowed the days to pass with less friction. Speaking required effort, and effort invited disappointment when nothing changed in response, while silence asked nothing and demanded nothing in return. The prisoners began to recognize that curiosity, once useful, now consumed energy without offering relief, and conserving that energy became more important than understanding details that carried no practical value. The camp continued to function with the same steady rhythm, indifferent to whether men spoke or remained quiet. Instructions were delivered the same way each day. Movements were guided by routine rather than explanation, and nothing about the system appeared to reward engagement. Over time, this consistency taught a lesson more effectively than any spoken rule, which was that participation in dialogue was optional, but participation in routine was unavoidable. Learning this distinction helped many men settle into a quieter form of endurance. Silence also reduced exposure. A question could draw attention, mark a man as uncertain, or invite scrutiny that felt unnecessary in an environment where visibility carried no advantage. Remaining quiet allowed individuals to blend into the group, to move with it rather than stand apart from it. This blending was not about hiding guilt or fear, but about minimizing the number of moments that required interpretation, because interpretation itself had become tiring. Within the barracks, this shift altered social dynamics subtly but decisively. Conversations that once revolved around speculation and shared uncertainty gave way to simple exchanges about immediate needs, if they happened at all. Long pauses were no longer uncomfortable, and sitting together without speaking became normal. In this shared quiet, each man carried his own thoughts privately, no longer expecting collective understanding to ease the burden of not knowing. The absence of questions also changed how time was experienced. Without the constant attempt to anticipate what might come next, attention narrowed to the present moment. Days were no longer measured by expectations, but by repetition, by the familiar sequence of sounds, movements, and intervals that define camp life. This narrowing of focus reduced anxiety for some, because it removed the need to imagine outcomes that could not be influenced, allowing the mind to rest inside what was immediately visible. For others, the silence created a sense of distance, as if they were watching themselves exist rather than actively participating in their own lives. Without questions to anchor identity or intention, days could pass with little internal commentary, leaving behind a faint sense of unreality. Yet even this detachment served a purpose, because it softened emotional responses that might otherwise have become overwhelming in an environment where nothing changed quickly enough to justify strong reaction. The guards continued their routines without acknowledging the shift, reinforcing the impression that silence fit neatly within the system. There were no rewards for compliance beyond the smooth continuation of the day, and no penalties for quiet withdrawal, only the steady progression of time. This neutrality made silence feel like the most efficient response, because it aligned with the structure rather than pushing against it. As weeks accumulated, The habit of silence deepened. Questions no longer formed automatically in the mind, and when they did, they were often dismissed before reaching speech, judged unnecessary or unhelpful. This internal filtering reduced cognitive strain, allowing men to move through the day with fewer interruptions, fewer disappointments, and fewer moments of frustration. In a place where answers were scarce, not asking became a form of control. By this stage, silence was no longer a reaction to the absence of explanation, but a preference shaped by experience. It allowed the prisoners to coexist with uncertainty without constantly confronting it, to conserve emotional resources, and to maintain a fragile balance within themselves. Curiosity had once promised clarity, but here it offered only repetition, while silence provided a narrow, practical path through captivity, one that required acceptance rather than understanding and endurance rather than resolution. As silence settled into daily life, understanding did not disappear, but it changed its form, moving away from explanation and toward observation. The prisoners no longer waited for answers, because waiting implied that someone intended to provide them, and that expectation had quietly dissolved. Instead, meaning was gathered through repetition, through noticing what happened the same way each day, and through recognizing which details never required clarification in order to function. In this way, knowledge became practical rather than verbal, built from patterns rather than instruction. Men learned when to stand and when to move by watching others rather than asking, and they learned the limits of the space by seeing where motion naturally stopped. Over time, the camp revealed itself through consistency, not transparency, and this consistency became a substitute for explanation. The absence of dialogue did not create chaos, because the system did not depend on being understood to operate smoothly. It depended only on being followed, and following required attention more than comprehension. This shift reduced the urgency that questions once carried. When behavior no longer relied on understanding reasons, curiosity lost its leverage. It became possible to exist without knowing why something happened, as long as it happened the same way every time. The men adjusted to this logic gradually, finding that predictability offered a form of stability even when meaning was withheld. The camp, in its quiet order, taught them that explanation was optional, but routine was not. Inside the barracks, this new way of understanding altered how men related to one another. Shared observation replaced shared speculation, and silence became a sign of awareness rather than withdrawal. When someone acted differently, it was noted without comment, not because it went unnoticed, but because commenting no longer served a purpose. Each man built his own internal map of the environment, relying less on collective interpretation and more on personal experience accumulated over time. The guards continued to function as before, offering no confirmation that the prisoner's understanding was accurate or complete. Instructions remained brief, gestures remained minimal, and silence remained the dominant response to uncertainty. This reinforced the idea that clarity was not something to be negotiated, but something to be inferred. The prisoners began to recognize that the camp did not require agreement, only alignment, and alignment could be achieved without explanation. As days passed, the absence of verbal guidance encouraged a different kind of attentiveness. Small details took on greater importance, such as the timing of movements, the placement of objects, and the unspoken signals that mark transitions between activities. This attentiveness filled the space that questions once occupied, giving the mind something to focus on without demanding answers. Observation became a skill, one that reduced the discomfort of not knowing by replacing it with familiarity. For some, this form of understanding brought a quiet sense of competence. Navigating the camp without asking questions created the feeling of having adapted successfully, of having learned how to exist within the structure without friction. For others, it created a distance from their former selves, as if the part of them that once sought explanation had been set aside. Yet, both responses allowed survival to continue without constant strain. And in that sense, the shift served its purpose. Over time, the difference between knowing and understanding blurred. The prisoners did not know why rules existed, but they understood how to live with them. They did not know what the future held, but they understood how to move through the present. This practical understanding reduced the need for language, because language was no longer the primary tool for orientation. The camp spoke through repetition, and the men learned to listen without expecting words. By the end of this phase, silence no longer felt like a response to withheld explanation, but like the natural environment in which daily life unfolded. Understanding had been reorganized, stripped of context and justification, and rebuilt around routine and observation. The men did not feel informed, but they felt oriented enough to continue. And in a place where answers were not offered, that orientation became sufficient, allowing life to proceed without the burden of questions that no longer changed anything. As understanding settled into this quieter, observational form, not knowing began to feel less like a deficiency and more like protection. Questions had once carried the risk of disappointment, because every unanswered inquiry reopened the awareness that control did not belong to them. By letting go of the need to know, many prisoners discovered that they could move through the day with fewer internal disruptions, accepting the limits of their situation without repeatedly colliding with them. In this way, ignorance was not imposed, but adopted, because it softened the edges of uncertainty. The camp continued unchanged, offering the same rhythms and boundaries that had slowly become familiar. Nothing in the environment demanded deeper comprehension, and nothing punished the absence of it. Men stood when others stood, moved when movement was expected, and rested when the day allowed it, all without requiring explanation. This mechanical flow reduced decision-making to a minimum, and with fewer decisions came fewer moments of doubt. The day asked only for presence, not understanding, and presence was easier to maintain. Within the barracks, the internal atmosphere shifted further. Thoughts that once spiraled outward toward unanswered questions now turned inward, focusing on sensation, routine, and memory. Some men counted steps, others memorized the pattern of light across the walls, and some simply allowed their minds to drift without direction. These private methods of coping replaced curiosity with containment, helping each man create a small, manageable world within the larger structure of the camp. Not knowing also altered emotional response. Without expectations, disappointment lost its force, and without anticipation, fear softened into caution. The absence of explanation meant that outcomes were no longer imagined in detail, which reduced the emotional weight attached to them. This detachment did not eliminate feeling, but it dulled extremes, creating a flatter emotional landscape that was easier to inhabit over long periods of time. The guards, whether intentionally or not, reinforced this adjustment by maintaining their distance. They did not offer reassurance, but they did not provoke confusion either. Their consistency suggested that the system did not depend on engagement, and this reinforced the prisoner's choice to withdraw curiosity. Over time, this mutual distance stabilized interactions, allowing both sides to operate without constant negotiation or misunderstanding. As weeks blended together, the men noticed that their memories of asking questions had grown faint. Curiosity, once an automatic response to uncertainty, now required effort to recall. In its place stood a practiced acceptance of limits, an understanding that some information would never arrive, and that waiting for it only prolonged discomfort. By not knowing, they reduced the number of internal conflicts they had to manage, conserving mental energy for endurance rather than inquiry. This shift was not uniform, and moments of doubt still surfaced, especially during quiet hours when the mind wandered freely. Yet even then, the impulse to ask was often dismissed before it formed fully, because experience had taught that answers were unnecessary for survival. The camp did not reward understanding, and it did not punish its absence. It simply continued, indifferent to whether it was fully comprehended. By this stage, not knowing had become a strategy rather than a symptom. It allowed the prisoners to coexist with uncertainty without constantly confronting it, creating a narrow sense of stability within an unstable situation. While this stability came at the cost of curiosity and engagement, it provided something equally valuable in captivity, which was the ability to move forward without being burdened by questions that no longer changed the shape of the day. By the time questions had fully disappeared, silence was no longer something the prisoners noticed, because it had become the medium through which daily life was processed. The mind no longer searched for explanations, and the absence of answers no longer created tension. Instead, silence performed the work that meaning once did, smoothing the passage of time and reducing the need to interpret events that could not be influenced. In this state, the days felt less confusing, even if they remained unresolved. Routine now carried almost all significance. Waking, lining up, working, resting, and returning to the barracks formed a closed loop that required no commentary. Each action followed the last with mechanical certainty, and that certainty replaced the reassurance that explanation might once have offered. The men learned that predictability, even without understanding, could provide a fragile sense of safety because it limited surprise and narrowed the range of possible outcomes. Inside this quiet structure, emotional responses flattened further. Hope did not vanish entirely, but it lost its urgency, becoming something distant rather than immediate. Fear, too, softened because fear often depends on imagined futures, and imagination had grown weaker without questions to fuel it. What remained was a subdued attentiveness to the present, where attention focused on what needed to be done rather than on what might happen next. The absence of questioning also reshaped identity. Without the habit of asking who, why, or when, the sense of self became less defined by intention and more by repetition. A man became what he did each day, not what he expected or understood. This shift did not feel dramatic, but it was profound because it replaced narrative with continuity, allowing existence to continue without requiring interpretation. Silence also altered memory. Days began to blur together, not because nothing happened, but because nothing demanded explanation. Without questions to separate moments, time compressed, and weeks passed with fewer distinct markers. The prisoners noticed this dimming of memory only occasionally, usually when trying to recall when a change had occurred and realizing that no single moment stood out clearly enough to name. The camp itself did not acknowledge this transformation because it did not need to. The system functioned whether the men understood it or not, and its indifference reinforced the value of silence as a coping mechanism. By not asking, the prisoners reduced friction with a structure that could not be persuaded or clarified, allowing daily life to proceed with minimal internal resistance. In this final phase, silence was no longer a response to confusion or withheld explanation. It had become a stable condition, one that allowed endurance without constant strain. The men no longer felt deprived of answers, because the need for answers had quietly dissolved. What mattered was not understanding the situation, but surviving within it, and silence proved sufficient for that purpose. As the days continued, unchanged and unannounced, the absence of questions marked the completion of a gradual transition. Curiosity had given way to observation, observation to acceptance, and acceptance to a quiet form of persistence. In this persistence, the prisoners found a way to move forward without explanation, carrying on through time, not because meaning had been restored, but because silence had taken over the work that meaning once performed. In the end, nothing signaled that the questions had truly stopped, because there was no moment when asking felt forbidden or unnecessary enough to announce. The silence simply remained, steady and unchallenged, filling the space where explanations might once have been expected. Life in the camp continued without interruption, shaped not by understanding, but by repetition and quiet endurance. The men did not forget how to ask questions, but they learned when questions no longer served them. In a place where answers carried no weight, silence became the most reliable response, allowing the days to pass without constant friction. What remained was not clarity, but stability, fragile and incomplete, yet sufficient to sustain them through time. When they later reflected on this period, it was not the lack of information they remembered most, but the way silence changed their relationship with uncertainty. By releasing the need to understand everything, they found a way to exist within conditions that offered no explanation. And in doing so, they discovered that endurance sometimes depends less on answers than on the ability to live without them. And so the story settles quietly, not with resolution, but with continuity, as the camp remained unchanged and the silence endured, carrying the men forward through days that asked nothing of them except presence, patience, and the willingness to let unanswered questions fade without resistance. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.